The barn door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. 8 terrified people pressed against Harriet Tubman in the suffocating darkness, their ragged breathing mixing with the distant howls of bloodhounds closing in for the kill. Moonlight sliced through gaps in the rotting wood, casting prison bar shadows across their faces. Why would the most wanted woman in America return to the plantation that had once owned her soul? But Harriet knew something that would either save them all or bury them alive. Beneath their feet lay a forgotten drainage system carved through stone and earth decades ago. And tonight, with bounty hunters circling like vultures and every escape route sealed in blood, she was about to gamble 8 innocent lives on a childhood memory that might be nothing more than a dead girl's dream. It was October 1857, and Harriet Tubman had led many successful rescue missions on the Underground Railroad. She'd never lost a single soul, but this mission was different. Every safe route north was blocked, every bridge was guarded, and now she was doing the one thing she'd sworn she'd never do. She was going backwards. The group huddled behind her included Sarah, a young mother whose baby hadn't stopped crying since they left 3 days ago, old Pete, whose wrinkled hands shook from both cold and fear, the Johnson family with their teenage daughter Mary, whose dark eyes burned with the same fierce determination Harriet recognized in herself, and Samuel, their guide, who'd been questioning Harriet's decision since the moment she announced they were turning around. They'd been traveling for 6 days when disaster struck. Samuel had returned from scouting ahead with terrible news that changed everything. The bridge into Pennsylvania was destroyed by a storm. Slave catchers with bloodhounds were watching every crossing point. Reward posters with Harriet's face were nailed to every tree, every fence post, every building. $1,000 dead or alive, more money than most men saw in a lifetime. "We're trapped," Samuel had whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "There's nowhere to run." That's when Harriet made the choice that shocked everyone. They weren't retreating. They were going to the Brodus plantation, back to her childhood prison, back to the place where she'd been beaten, starved, and broken. "Miss Harriet," Sarah whispered, clutching her baby tighter, "that place will kill us." Harriet looked at each frightened face. "When I was 12, I watched an old slave named Moses disappear into the barn floor. He showed me something, an old drainage channel that runs under the ground. If it's still there, it leads to the river." Old Pete's eyes went wide. "You mean there's a way under the plantation?" "Maybe," Harriet said quietly. "It's our only chance." What she kept hidden would terrify them. Harriet hadn't seen that drainage system in 15 years. She didn't know if it was still open, still passable, didn't know if it had collapsed or been discovered. Most dangerous of all, she didn't know who owned the plantation now that Edward Brodus was dead. The walk back took 3 hours through swamp and thick woods. Harriet led them in a wide circle, approaching the plantation from the north where the tree line came closest to the main house. Every step of the way, memories flooded back. The crack of the overseer's whip, the hunger that gnawed at her belly every night, the time Brodus threw a 2-pound weight at her head when she was just 13, leaving her with seizures that still plagued her to this day. As they got closer, Harriet could see the plantation more clearly. The big house looked smaller than she remembered. Paint was peeling. Several windows were boarded up. Either the Brodus family had fallen on hard times, or they'd simply stopped caring about maintaining their property. The barn where she planned to enter looked exactly the same. Redwood siding, peaked roof, double doors facing east toward the main house. But something felt wrong, too quiet. Even for nighttime, there should have been some signs of life. Chickens moving in their coop, a dog barking in the distance, the snoring of field hands in the slave quarters. Instead, there was nothing but silence. "Something's not right," whispered Samuel, voicing what they were all thinking. Harriet held up her hand for absolute quiet. She strained her ears, listening for any sound that might indicate danger. After 5 full minutes, she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the main house. Then she saw him, a figure moving past an upstairs window, carrying what looked like a lantern. The figure paused at the window, and for one terrifying moment, Harriet thought he was looking directly at them. But the figure moved on, disappearing from view. "We wait until that light goes out," she breathed to the group. "Nobody moves before then." 20 minutes passed. The light finally disappeared. Harriet waited another 10 minutes to be sure, then gestured for them to follow her toward the barn. They moved in single file, staying low, using shadows to hide their approach. Sarah's baby chose that moment to whimper softly. Sarah pressed him closer to her chest, whispering a silent lullaby in his ear. They reached the barn without incident. Harriet pressed her ear against the wooden door, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing. She lifted the latch as quietly as possible and opened the door just wide enough for them to slip through. The smell hit her immediately. Hay, horse manure, leather, and something else. Something that reminded her of her childhood, of early mornings mucking stalls before the sun came up. It was the smell of her past, and it made her stomach turn. But there was no time for sentiment. Harriet led them to the back corner of the barn, where she remembered seeing old Moses disappear one night when she was 12 years old. She'd followed him, curious, and watched him move a pile of grain sacks to reveal a wooden trapdoor in the floor. The grain sacks were gone, replaced by modern equipment she didn't recognize, but when she knelt down and felt around in the darkness, her fingers found what she was looking for. The edge of the trapdoor, hidden under decades of dirt and hay. "Help me move this equipment," she whispered to the men. Old Pete and Samuel began carefully moving the heavy machinery, while Harriet and the women cleared away debris. After 10 minutes of work, they had the trapdoor completely exposed. Harriet grabbed the iron ring and pulled. The door didn't budge. She tried again, putting all her weight into it. Still nothing. "It's rusted shut," Samuel whispered. That's when Mary Johnson stepped forward with something in her hand, a hairpin. She'd been quietly working it into a makeshift tool while the men moved equipment. "Let me try," she said, inserting the pin into the latch mechanism. After several tense minutes, they heard a soft click. Mary had managed to release the rusted lock. This time when Harriet pulled, the trapdoor swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire barn. Below them was a set of wooden stairs leading down into complete darkness. The smell that wafted up was musty and damp, but there was something else. Fresh air. That meant the tunnel was still open, still connected to the outside. Then the nightmare began. Voices, coming from outside the barn, getting closer. "Someone's out there," she whispered urgently. "Everyone down into the tunnel, now." One by one they descended into the darkness. Harriet went last, pulling the trapdoor shut above them just as she heard the barn door creak open. They stood in complete darkness at the bottom of the stairs, hardly daring to breathe. Above them they could hear footsteps moving around the barn. Heavy boots, at least 2 people, maybe 3. "I'm telling you, I heard something," a man's voice said. "Something moving around in here. Probably just rats," another voice replied. "This whole place is falling apart, has been ever since the old man died." Harriet's heart stopped. Brodus was dead. That changed everything. She didn't know who owned the plantation now, didn't know their habits, their security measures, their temperament. The footsteps continued moving around above them. Someone was conducting a thorough search of the barn. They heard the sound of equipment being moved, hay being kicked around, horses snorting nervously in their stalls. Sarah's baby began to squirm in her arms, making soft noises that seemed deafeningly loud in the confined space. Sarah pressed him closer, trying to keep him quiet, but babies don't understand the concept of mortal danger. The footsteps stopped directly above the trapdoor. Dust particles drifted down through cracks in the wooden boards, settling on their shoulders like grave dirt. Everyone held their breath. If the searchers discovered the trapdoor, if they opened it and found them there, the game was over. There would be no escape, no second chances. They would all be killed, or worse, taken back to slavery, to serve as examples of what happened to runaways. Sarah's baby squirmed in her arms, and she pressed her hand gently over his mouth, tears streaming down her face. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was their hearts pounding like war drums in their chests. Then the footsteps moved away. They heard the barn door slam shut, followed by voices fading into the distance. They waited another 10 minutes before anyone dared to speak. "That was too close," Samuel whispered. Harriet fumbled around in the darkness until she found what she was looking for, a shelf built into the tunnel wall, and on that shelf, exactly where old Moses had left it, was a lantern and matches. The matches were damp, and most wouldn't light, but she finally got the lantern lit on her 5th try. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, carved out of earth and stone. The walls were supported by wooden beams that looked older than anything Harriet had ever seen. Some sections of the ceiling had partially collapsed, but the tunnel was still passable. "This is it," she said, holding the lantern high. "This is our way to freedom." They began walking single file through the tunnel. Harriet led with the lantern, followed by Sarah and her baby, then the Johnson family, old Pete bringing up the rear with Samuel. The tunnel sloped gently downward as they moved north toward the river. After 20 minutes of walking, they encountered their first major obstacle. A section of the tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow gap near the ceiling. They could see clear passage beyond the obstruction, but getting through would require crawling on their bellies through mud and debris. "I'll go first," Harriet said, handing the lantern to Samuel. She squeezed through the gap, feeling rocks scrape against her back and mud soak through her clothes. On the other side, she called back softly, "It's clear. Send the baby through first." Sarah reluctantly handed her son through the gap to Harriet, then squeezed through herself. One by one they all made it through, though old Pete needed help from both ends due to his arthritis. The tunnel continued for what felt like hours but was probably only another 30 minutes. Harriet began to worry that they might be lost, that the tunnel might not actually connect to the river as old Moses had claimed. But then she saw it. A faint glimmer of moonlight ahead. The tunnel ended at a cave-like opening concealed by hanging willow branches. Beyond the branches, Harriet could see the Choptank River flowing quietly in the moonlight, and tied to a small dock that was barely visible among the reeds was something that made her heart soar. A boat. The boat wasn't empty. Someone was sitting in it, a figure wearing dark clothes impossible to identify in the shadows. The person appeared to be waiting for something, or someone. Harriet motioned for the others to stay hidden while she crept closer to get a better look. As her eyes adjusted to the moonlight, she could make out more details. The figure was a woman, elderly, wearing a dark shawl. She sat perfectly still, as if she'd been waiting there for hours. When Harriet was close enough to whisper, she called out softly, "Who's there?" The woman turned. Even in the dim light, Harriet could see she was smiling. "I wondered if you'd remember Moses's old path," the woman said. "He told me before he died that he'd shown it to a young girl, said she was special, that one day she might need it. It was Ruth, old Moses's daughter. She'd been freed years ago when her owner died and had been working with the Underground Railroad ever since. Somehow she'd known they would need help tonight." "How did you know we'd come this way?" Harriet asked. Ruth's smile widened. "I've been watching you, child. When word spread about the blocked bridges, I knew you might remember what Moses taught you. I've been waiting here every night for a week." Ruth was hiding something deadly. She'd been tracking Harriet's movements for months through Underground Railroad contacts. When the manhunt intensified and escape routes closed, Ruth had positioned herself here with supplies and a bigger boat. But what she hadn't told them was that slave catchers had been questioning her neighbors. They suspected her involvement with the Underground Railroad. Coming here tonight put her own freedom at risk. One wrong move and Ruth herself could be captured, enslaved, or killed. Within minutes, all 8 fugitives were in Ruth's boat, being rowed quietly across the Choptank River toward the Maryland shore. From there, Ruth knew another route north that avoided the watched bridges. As they reached the far shore, Harriet looked back at the Brodus plantation one last time. The place that had held her in bondage for so many years had ultimately provided her with the means to save 8 more lives. "Sometimes," Ruth said quietly, following Harriet's gaze, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes the very place that tried to break you becomes the place that sets others free." 3 days later, all 8 people reached freedom in Pennsylvania. Sarah's baby took his first steps on free soil. Old Pete lived to see his grandchildren born free. The Johnson family started a successful farm outside Philadelphia, and Harriet Tubman, she went back south exactly 2 weeks later to bring out her next group. Because that's what Moses did. She kept going back until every one of her people was free. But this mission, this night when she returned to the plantation that had once owned her, remained special. It proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is face your past in order to secure someone else's future. Over the years, Harriet Tubman would tell people about that night, about the courage it took to return to the Brodus plantation, about the tunnel that old Moses had shared with her decades before, about Ruth waiting in the boat like an answer to prayer. The secret she buried was darker. When she was crawling through that collapsed section of tunnel, covered in mud and struggling to breathe, she almost turned back. For just a moment, the fear overwhelmed her completely. The weight of 8 lives on her shoulders felt heavier than the tons of earth above her head. The fear of being caught, of failing, of leading innocent people to their deaths in a drainage ditch that might end in a dead end. Her hands shook as she pulled herself through the narrow gap, and for one terrifying moment, she thought about telling them all to go back, to take their chances with the slave catchers rather than die buried alive in this forgotten tunnel. But then she thought about something old Moses had told her the night he showed her that tunnel. He said, "Child, courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and doing what's right anyway." That's what Harriet Tubman did that night. She was afraid, more terrified than she'd ever been in her life, but she did what was right anyway. She led 8 people to freedom through a tunnel that connected her past to their future, and that's exactly why they called her Moses. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she did the right thing despite her fear. That night in the tunnel proved something crucial. Sometimes the very place that once held you captive becomes the key to setting others free. What do you think? If you were in Harriet's position that night, would you have had the courage to return to save 8 people? Would you have crawled through that dark tunnel not knowing what deadly dangers waited? How far would we go to help others find freedom? Are we willing to face our past for someone's future? Hit that like button and subscribe for more story.